want to play my part in telling the story of this development. We focused on a part of the city, APDG, which is the Pitt, George, Daly and Alfred Street block, back in 2008. It was moribund. It was unable to be renewed, and what was on it from the 60s was the worst of the worst. So Michael Harrison, who was a director of strategy at the city at the time, and myself, director of planning, worked on a review of how we could generate public space, connected public space, and unlock these land ownership patterns which were unable to be renewed as they were. And we made an LEP change. And it was an LEP change that had options. So we left the existing LEP as it was, and we created opt-in possibilities. You could opt in if you wanted to redevelop your site in exchange for public domain. We ended up doing one, two, I think it's third opt-in option with the base LEP existing until the exact willingness and ability of all the owners could be finally sorted. For example, the original opt-in believed that an Ausgrid's substation and a Telstra exchange could be redeveloped. No. Telstra were not going to redevelop at that time, that's almost 10 years ago, and Ausgrid were not going to be redeveloped. So that completely changed the original assumptions. So that, in a way, we've been living with this for about 8 years as a planning framework using opt-in provisions. And it was only possible because we, and Monica spoke about this morning, we had the basic policy framework to handle the opt-in provisions if that was going to be taken up. So the plan, every city needs a plan. Monica spoke, for those of you who saw the keynote address, opening address this morning, that's Sustainable Sydney 2030. It's essential that both the private and the public interests, however they're defined, are powerfully combined. And when I talk about public interest, I'm talking about things like dedication and air rights, not what was the case in the 70s, 80s and 90s, pseudo-public space, for example, which is a discussion point in the UK at the moment. So, for example, the MLC Centre, the Australia Square and the National Bank have pseudo-public space. That was a development in exchange for a plaza. We are working on a framework where it's actually dedicated. So if it becomes public, it remains public. So it's become far easier to pursue this because the up-and-coming generations that live and work in the city have much more compatible expectations with the successful public policy positions. And the goals don't just come out of thin air. They're expressed in policies, but they're given teeth in action plans. And so the strategic directions of 2030 is the master vision. And I'm really just a translator, a facilitator. I don't make any decisions, I just recommend. And so we have made sure in recommending that our planning tools are instruments that deliver incentives that the property industry can use. So Big Move 1 in 2030 is, and that's the first mission of Sydney, Sustainable Sydney 2030, is a revitalised city centre, the heart of global Sydney. Priorities. Sydney has a unique geography. A few people mentioned that this morning, particularly visitors to the city. It's actually got a unique history and a unique climate. You could say it's actually a unique DNA. And it actually needs to be understood and taken to the next stage. Much of the focus of the city is about people-centric, and that's been a lot of the discussion points today. But some of the long-standing priorities, and they stem from a moment in time in 1971 when a particular reformed council, a particular consultant and a particular support team got together and in 9 months produced the 1971 strategic plan. Many of the strategic visions of that plan are still current today. Some of the detail of that plan is not. For example, overhead bridges, colonnade setbacks in exchange for height and so on, the tools. So you can see the big ideas of that plan, which was pedestrianisation of the city heart, and of course in September, I think, 1971, the first block of Martin Place was closed to traffic, and it was a street up until then. It was progressively closed, and this was one of the council's big projects. That thinking has been brought to George Street, the pedestrianisation of George Street and the spine, and therefore the treatment of all of the lanes and public spaces to George Street is a project. And this is where this particular development, which hasn't been approved yet, sits. So when we talk about public interest, it's manifest in the controls for the city, the sun access planes for the special places, the unique transferable heritage floor space scheme, which has saved permanently more than 80 buildings, including the GPO, the connectedness of public space, and of course the increase of public space, quality public space, the fine grain retail, but moreover support for small business to have a foothold in the city, and to fill culture gaps, because a lot of that less core GDP earning activity that actually makes a city has been pushed out of the CBD, all the theatres and so on. And we are looking at opportunities to redress that. Ultimately, knowledge workers is a general term, but we want to understand, because that group is the generation who have valued the city, want to stay in the city, have opinions about the city. They aren't the bankers from the 80s who hop in a Jag and drive to the suburbs. They partially live, partially occupy, and probably in the end will have a very strong bond with the city. So we want to extend the connectedness of public spaces in George Street. We want to take an outdoor gallery approach to public art, and we want to encourage cultural experimentation, which I mentioned has been put off. And in a way, as automation of work and services looms large into the future, those survival jobs are important because they're going to contribute to the transformative development of the public and private interests simultaneously going forward. So we have tools and we have incentives. We have built a lexicon of dialogue with the property industry, and I think they fully understand where we're going. And really it's just a question of negotiation and adherence in some instances. So the sun access planes that protect the 12 parks and public spaces in the city, the transferable heritage floor space that I've mentioned, the opt-in for extra height in exchange for new public spaces, which this project falls under. Innovation, startup, trying to get a foothold for small business and other business in the city is a focus. End of trip and cultural spaces bonus. Small business and fine grain retail on lanes where it wasn't before is an activation bonus. Of course, we have our design excellence program, and that leads to either height or floor space, 10% bonus, and the public art program. So in this case, the Circular Quay Tower, which I think that the site came into Lendlease's possession as a result of a deal with Barangaroo, and that was Westpac, who owns St George, went to Barangaroo, one of the towers, and part of the deal was to acquire the property of that they were leaving or something like that. You'd know the detail. And that's how, out of the blue, Lendlease ended up with the St George site on George Street, which we never thought would ever get redeveloped. Would just be a 60s or 70s, early 70s perhaps, just sit there, fully developed, maximum floor space ratio, and that was it. But circumstances do change, and we saw the opportunity, as did Lendlease. They were just trying to understand the opportunity. Should we develop? Should we not? Should we sell it on? Is this a passive exchange, or is this a real opportunity? And we started with a conversation, which is what cities are good for. So come forward to today. The EY development, that tower which FJMT has done, is the first piece of the puzzle. And it is waiting for the demolition of the St George building and the creation of the George Street Plaza, which is only created because Mirvac's public space that's required under the LEP is exchanged for development to create the site for the Lendlease Tower and to be consolidated to create the plaza. So we were able to make one consolidated public plaza, space, square, whatever you like, on George Street, whereas before, with the earlier options, they were contained in the lane that runs between Pitt and George Street. I'm sure someone will show you a plan. So I'm just going to concentrate on two things that we were looking at. The idea of tech clusters. We done an economic development strategy. We're mindful that there are different precincts and different focuses, whether it be bio or fintech or whatever. We developed a tech startup action plan to sit under that economic development strategy, and one of its actions was that we should examine opportunities to support tech startups which are high risk meaning they can fail. And the workspace, the events and the launches, this needs to be done in a coordinated way with Jobs for New South Wales, not on our own. They need flexible format, they need high ceiling workspace, they don't need views, for example. T-shirts don't need views, but suits do. So after the original planning proposal to transfer height around the space to create George Street went out on exhibition and got gateway, this tech startup plan emerged and was resolved and supported by council. And Lendlease saw an opportunity to offer 3,900 or 4,000 metres of tech startup space at the bottom of the building that has no views. But it could really energise the public spaces, really energise the laneway network that was being created, and it did meet our ambition. And so we were able to treat that as bonus floor space equal to the amount of floor space that they made available to the city for that tech startup. So that was a coming of minds. And the second area, which is equally important, is creative clusters. So one can't go without the other, in a way. When you talk to knowledge worker experts or representatives, they talk about the cultural and creative life of the destination city being the thing that does attract. And I think they're talking about it because that's the one area that isn't being discussed necessarily by the businesses that are seeking to attract that talent. But we could see that, and so we got a cultural development strategy, and we really looked at creative startups. Where can they be? What kind of culture that could be? And we produced a draft policy with great fanfare. It was launched at Walsh Bay in the theatre with a vast number of people involved in the arts attending. And it had a number of actions. And one of those actions is to create performance-ready space, support temporality, expect the unexpected, but essentially to build in the infrastructure for the possibility of things to happen. So when we considered the plaza, we talked about a community building being on the edge of the plaza to help mediate the scale, but we did want it to be flexible, in a way performance ready. We didn't really want to settle on what it might be used for because we also wanted the zeitgeist to inform us. But we knew it had an indoor and outdoor use, and it would have daytime and nighttime modes. And it would work well with the business innovation space. So to close, and the architects, I'm sure, and everyone will be able to explain various parts of the scheme, but it was a realistic and achievable opportunity to unlock the floor space potential of the site, to meet the demand for high-end global office space. It did lead to the significant revitalisation of the blocks bounded by those 4 streets. And you can see the yellow covers the public space and lane plan that's being created by the 5 developments of that block. It did achieve the remodelling of Jackson's on George, which is a sad 24-hour licensed premises. It did deliver significant fine grain network on the lanes, new retail destination. By lifting the foyer, all of that ground was liberated at the lane level, Pitt Street level, for businesses, small businesses. They're less than 100 square metres per tenancy, and their activity. Large public square on George Street, excellent solar access, because the studies showed that at lunchtime it got winter sun between Regent Hotel and the northern part of the Circular Quay, right onto the square. And then later it gets a second dose of sun in winter at, I think, 3 p.m. A new public square at Rugby Place. I think that's kind of a sweet name. And Rugby Place is down at the Pitt Street level, about 3 metres lower than George Street. It'll be a new late night trading precinct, because we want to enhance the nighttime economy. It does reduce vehicular movements within the block, and we've rationalised the loading docks and vehicular access points. It does deliver a new community building, 3 stories high approximately, and a new cycle facility, particularly for the businesses that don't get the corporate largesse of, but are the ancillary, the retailers, the shop assistants and so on. We do get the delivery of the business innovation space as proposed in the tech startup plan. So this has all been guided by a suite of policies and action plans, and nothing about the public interest was ad hoc. It was strategically decided by council. And it was just a question of, is this an opportunity to achieve both private and public outcomes? So thank you.
My 14-year-old daughter actually said to me, "Mum, it's late in the day. I think you should put in as many jokes as you possibly can." But you'll be relieved to know that I've decided not to take that tact. And I am going to talk to you about our project, Circular Quay Tower, which is right there. The site sits between Pitt and George Street, as Graham has mentioned, and it adjoins the new Wanda Hotel and Residential Tower, and sits north of 200 George Street, Mirvac's 200 George Street, which is to the south. So for those of you not from Sydney, the project is very close to Circular Quay, the main ferry hub, which is adjacent to the Sydney Opera House. Circular Quay Tower is a $1.6 billion project and will be delivered in partnership by Lendlease with Ping An and Mitsubishi. The fact that we have this international investment is a testament to the quality of the development that we'll be producing. As Graham alluded to, we have 2 new public plazas, which are shown in the layouts here, a community building, a laneway network of cafes, which will include cafes, bars, convenience, retail and health services. And of course, we will be repositioning the very famous Jackson's on George, which is well overdue for a refurbishment, as well as Sydney's tallest commercial tower, which will sit at 263 metres tall, delivered by the wonderful Foster & Partners, designed by the wonderful Foster & Partners, I should say. And Ross will obviously talk in more detail about the architecture. So I'm going to talk about primarily why we have decided to develop such a tall tower here, what has been the benefit of working with the city on this project, why Circular Quay Tower will exceed expectations, and what is our ambition for the tower and why. As you know, Sydney is similar to Manhattan. It's a peninsula. There's very little space for it to expand and little land left for us to develop. So Barangaroo, which is shown in the blue section of this map here, was obviously a key move for the city to expand some unused area and create a significant part of a significant amount of office space responding to the market requirement. And Barangaroo is primarily let now. So rents have moved, and economically this allows us to think about knocking down existing and rebuilding existing product. With the shortage of available land within the city, it creates or it makes sense to create more public space while creating additional height in a smaller building footprint. And capitalising on these extraordinary views and this amazing location has helped us to do that. So what is our ambition for the tower and why? The current site, which is, as Graham mentioned, has been vacated by Westpac out of the relocation into Barangaroo, looks nothing like what you see on the screen here. It really is a pretty ordinary part of the city and it's well overdue for a revamp. So we plan to actually create a new place for Sydney, a new place that Sydney can be in. Similar to what we did at Barangaroo, we'll do the same thing here. So we've run a series of tenant workshops just to reconfirm what we understand the key focus of our tenant market is. And as we all know, that's primarily around attracting and retaining talent. Businesses are competing globally to secure the right people to work in their businesses, and that's not such an easy thing to do. When you're looking at potential candidates, it's really important that they're considering, or the building and the amenity that we provide is an important part of that consideration for talent. It's no longer just about the building and the workplace, but it's actually about the actual location and the energy that sits around the building itself. So our ambition for this project is to transform this location and keep Sydney competitive with the rest of the world's great cities, and to create a place that workers and visitors remember and love. A place that people are drawn to because of its energy, its amenity, its unique retail, its spectacular art and remarkable architecture. The ground plane and the shared spaces will work very hard to deliver this, along with a tower that will create a spectacular landmark worthy of this location. Unfortunately, this ambition is shared with the City of Sydney, and we're working hard together to try and achieve it. What are the benefits of working with the city in defining the project? Well, obviously government's already done a lot of the hard lifting in this location for us by committing a significant investment into the ferry terminals and also the introduction of light rail. But working closely with the city on this specific site has allowed us to create meaningful public space and amenity for the community, as Graham mentioned. Over 45% of the site, which is quite remarkable for a site that's so constrained, will be dedicated to public space. The existing buildings on the site provide actually no public space, so it really is quite a significant improvement. By working with the city and Foster and Partners, we've developed a scheme to open up the ground plane and create community infrastructure. The additional space and costs have been offset by the ability to add height to the tower. George Street Public Plaza, Rugby Plaza, a public bike hub, a significant contribution to public art, and the three-level community building will all be delivered for the City of Sydney. As I mentioned, our scheme includes a network of pedestrian laneways that cross the site at different levels and allow us to connect into the adjacent developments. The City of Sydney is keen to see retail that supports small local businesses, and hence the development is incentivised to keep these retail outlets small, under 100 square metres and facing the laneways. So given that these types of retailers do not attract the same rents as the larger format chain retailers, the floor space incentive actually allows us to sustain that within the development. So we believe this will allow us to create a much more interesting and unique retail offering. It's consistent with what our tenants are looking for: small, interesting cafes, places to escape from the office during the day or after work, and actually add some activity and energy to the city. That wouldn't be possible for us without the support of the city. Graham mentioned the business innovation space that will be delivered within the tower. We're currently in consultation with the city to explore the ultimate operational model for this space. We're planning a series of workshops where we'll look at how we pitch this along the lines of global standards that are existing within more advanced markets of Boston and London and the like. So partnering will allow us to make Circular Quay appeal to the global businesses and reinforce Sydney as a global player. Why will Circular Quay Tower be such a great workplace and exceed expectations? At Lendlease, we're constantly studying workplace and how office buildings and precincts are utilised by some of the world's most progressive businesses. We're always looking to better understand our customer and the drivers for change in workplace, including technology, shift in economy, social change. We've learned that the best places for work are not just about the workplace, but are a combination of a whole range of factors. As I've mentioned, it's about amenity, creating a place that people want to be in. As well as doing all of those things, Circular Quay Tower will actually be the most efficient building that Lendlease has ever developed, with every square metre of the floor space having access, to views and natural light. And the side core that you see in this floor plate and the column-free space is what allows us to do that. Whilst much of the existing stock in the CBD has fire stairs, lifts and toilets sitting in the centre of the floor plate, this configuration of a side core, where you move all of those amenities to the back side of the building, will allow the workplace to have additional access to views and light for all of the occupants, not just the executives who sit on the harbour side. As well as this highly efficient floor plate, we're targeting a new standard in workplace health and wellness. We have 6-star Green Star rating targeted, 5-star neighbours and platinum wellness. Every aspect of Circular Quay Tower has been designed precisely to benefit workers and visitors. We're still in the design process and we still have some hurdles to move through, but we're planning to open this very exciting new precinct in 2021. The city's expecting the building to be something incredible and in one of Sydney's most iconic places, so it's a very exciting time for the city and for the project team. Circular Quay Tower will be benchmarked and is a new chapter for Sydney, keeping Sydney on the map as a global destination. Thank you.
What I wanted to focus on really was is 5 main images, but the reason why I'm saying that is because we really wanted to kind of convey how we see the project at 5 different scales. The first one is the cityscape. Cityscape, what does that mean? To us, I think it means the way it sits in the city. What does it look like? And I think that is a very important subject. It's not necessarily just this perspective from the harbour, it's the way that the building looks like from all sides, whether it's from the parks, whether it's from the east or the west, or towards the CBD to the south. We've developed a design very closely with the input of engineering companies. The structural engineers are very critical to this process, and for all of you who saw Gerard Evenden's presentation this morning, he gave a sort of insight as to how that structure was developed. It will be the tallest commercial floor plate in Sydney when it's finished, and part of the uniqueness of the structure was created as a result of its stage 1 DA massing, where it had this vertical V at the front of the building, which generated the structural design. The precinct. So for the precinct, Graham mentioned APDG block, Alfred Pitt, Daly and George Street. It's a bit of a dry kind of word for this precinct, but I think what's very important about the precinct is what it is now and what it could be in the future and what it will be in the future. And the important thing to us is that in terms of the brief that was very interesting was that city block currently really divides the city. It's quite narrow, it has quite good connections north-south. In fact, a lot of the laneways actually exist in this city block currently, but they're just not used. They're the places that are sort of inhabited by refuse trucks and car park access and so on. So they're kind of really dead spaces. So the precinct and the change of that precinct is critical. It's not just the project we're doing here for Lendlease, but it's the projects also, the Wonder development to the north. And I think the fascinating thing about the whole job is the work that the city's done with Graham and his team in terms of bringing these sites together and seeing them kind of cohesively. What can we do here? What can we create? And that's obviously taken years. So for Foster and Partners, we're newcomers to this process. It's really about, for us, developing the design and delivering a world-class building. The other important aspect of the precinct is the new components of the brief. What does this building and tower give to the City of Sydney? It's been mentioned by the other presenters, but I'll just go through them again. It brings business innovation space. It creates a new community building and plaza space. And it generates some new through-site links that actually go through the building itself. In terms of history, there's the tank stream. It's actually an underground, the original stream that served Sydney Cove. That's been a technical challenge of the project, and it runs down Pitt Street. The street. These towers have to work at ground level. The way these towers hit the ground is a fascinating subject that architects like to talk about a great deal, and you will have heard about these in some of the other presentations. So their impact at ground level is really critical. In this particular building, it fronts onto Pitt Street, and this elevation you see here is the Pitt Street elevation. It has a staircase that leads up to the main foyer, but importantly, this is the only elevation that the tower actually fronts directly onto. On the other side, it fronts onto George Street, but it sits behind the new plaza. So on this elevation, the street elevation is tied in terms of height and scale according to the LEP and DC plan guidelines. The other big impact that these towers have that must be considered very carefully is their environmental impact, and there's two components to that. There's the environmental impact of the tower itself, the energy it uses, and so on. I'm not going to focus on that today, but more to just raise the concept of wind mitigation and things like that. So how the wind permeates around these buildings is very critical, and it's critical to the success of the urban realm in terms of streets. Is it a livable place? Can people sit and drink coffee and so on? The laneways. We've heard a lot about laneways and how they bring life into the city, and that for us was a very interesting aspect of the project, particularly when we were going through the competition process. This view that you see here is taken from the new Rugby Plaza, so this is the lower plaza level. To the right of the image will be the new community building and the upper plaza at George Street level. This change of level across the site has been a key generator in terms of the way we plan the building. So the main tower lobby for the building doesn't actually hit the ground plane. The ground plane is fully surrounded by the laneways retail component. You can see on the right-hand side of the image is a lightweight bridge that brings people across to the main entrance. The other important aspect is that within the facilities, there are also the end-of-trip facilities for the actual tower users, but the new cycle facilities, which is 250 bike spaces and changing facilities for the City of Sydney. The business innovation space is located immediately above this, and when we get to the video, you'll see a section where the camera drops down the full height of the tower, and you will notice there's a big slice towards the lower third of the building, and that breaks the business innovation space off, so it's expressed at the lower part of the building. I'll return to that in a second. Nourish. Well, what do I mean by that? I'm just going to read a quote from the Oxford Dictionary. If you nourish a feeling or belief or plan, you think about it a lot and encourage it. Why is that important? This is a photograph that we've taken actually a couple of days ago. That's Underwood Street as it is now, and how it will look. But the Kimberley and Graham mentioned a couple of other projects and cities, Boston, and something I'd just like to sort of talk about very briefly. We think this project is very forward-thinking. The mix of the business innovation space, the laneways, and the tower components is in many ways quite unique. And I've had the fortune of working on a couple of very interesting projects, which are laboratories projects in Stanford University, and one in the UAE, which was an affiliation with MIT in Boston. Why do I mention that? And I think I mention that because, in terms of their brief, we had to deliver laboratory buildings that were very technical. There was a technical component to it. But the other side of it, and what was fascinating from the client teams, was they were really interested in how people meet. What makes people want to go to that building? What makes people talk to each other and ultimately generate new ideas and discoveries? So the mixture in this brief of the business innovation space, creating spaces where people might want to be, and tourists at the ground plane, could ultimately lead to new generation of ideas. The business innovation space is where the ideas of the future will come from. The investment might come from the people in the tower above. How do they meet? They meet in the city, where, as Graham rightly says, it's a good place for conversations. And I think that's absolutely critical, and certainly in terms of a Stanford University project, fundamental to the success of those laboratory buildings. In terms of the art component, we are working with Leo Villarreal. He's an international American artist, a lighting artist. He's just won the lighting of the bridges in London. And Nicole Monks, who's an Australian artist. And they will have their art integrated into the public realm. The film I'm going to show is just a simple rendering. It's not colored to be representative of the actual materials. It just shows the project as it sits in the city and where we've got to in terms of the design today. Why do I show it? Because I think it's very important that when we look at this building, we as engineers and architects delivering projects all around the world, the way these things sit in the city and appear is very crucial. They have a long and significant impact. If anybody was to say, what words would you like to be mentioned about this project in the future, I would like it to be talked about as being elegant, refined, functional. Everything in this design is optimized, whether it be its structure or lifting. On the elevation that faces the CBD to the south, we have the scenic lifts that animate that elevation, provide a dynamism to the facade. It's an extension of the work we did at Deutsche Bank and Phillip Street. But the structural diagram, and you can see these two leading columns that was discussed at the presentation Gerald gave this morning, are a key generator of this diagonal structure. In conclusion, I'd like to close with another definition taken from the dictionary, and actually the more known definition of nourish. To provide people or living things with food in order to make them grow and to keep them healthy. For us, Sydney as a city, as with all cities, is a living thing. We are very privileged with this project to have been given all the necessary high-quality ingredients from the work that's been done by Lendlease and Graham and the City of Sydney to deliver a project, and a project of perfect nourishment for the City of Sydney. And we look forward to being completed. Thank you.
Sort of reflect back to when our founder, Dick Dusseldorp, created Australia Square, and its big give back was the plaza of Australia Square, and it's now enshrined in the overshadowing rules of the city. And you look at the context of that, and that was done at a time where that sort of thing wasn't done. The plaza that we're creating here, I'd like to get your individual views around what do you think that plaza is for the city and how it will be used as a context. Start with you.
Start with me. I agree in one way that Australia Square was a benchmark project at the time, and it was an integrated approach towards the plaza building, the tower and the open space, although it wasn't a very successful relationship to the two side streets, Curtin Place and Bond Street. But the public space has been as successful since the day it was created till now. It is so populated most times of the day, and really it's waiting to get the same level of activation on the weekends, which it doesn't, because that part of the city hasn't got that energy which this project is going to bring, partly because we're integrating layers and layers of interest to duplicate the facilities and the space usage. So I'll just say it is kind of part of that genesis, but it's the next generation. And I think it's the next generation because A, it's genuinely publicly owned. And there is a difference, a big difference. The second thing is its position on George Street, and the idea, the organising idea, the legibility idea that George Street is the pedestrian and transportation north-south link will be reinforced by all the moments along the street, Barrack Street, Regimental Square, this square, and leading to Alfred Street, potentially the Town Hall Square, Sydney Square, and ultimately the education precinct, Railway Square, the square for 20-somethings. That's the big picture that takes 50 years to pull off. So I see it's part but not the same. It's part of that approach, but it's not the same.
No, that's fair. Kimberley, for you?
So I think Australia Square is gorgeous, and one of the highlights of my career was taking Harry Seidler on a site visit on a Friday afternoon when we were refurbishing Australia Square retail, and having him see how alive and busy that space was. And he was just thrilled, over the moon, that it was performing exactly as he had intended for it to exist, which was a great experience.
When was that?
That was quite some time ago.
Thanks for that, Graham.
So I hope that this plaza, the George Street Plaza, has a level of energy. It'll be obviously a different type of energy to what Australia Square has. But it's important for us as an arrival space to the tower. But I'm also hoping that it will be almost a meeting point, because the community building will very much activate that place with whatever activities are being run in the space, as well as the retail that we have in Jackson's on George. But to provide a place in the square that is public, as you've mentioned, that you don't need to actually pay to arrive in, that can allow the tower occupants and the community to genuinely blend, I think would be a great outcome for us.
Yeah, so I think that is an important point. The plaza space at Australia Square is really a corporate plaza space for lunch and having drinks after work, and, you know, it's seriously yuppie, if that's the appropriate word. But George...
Beers are about $12 each, so right. I agree with you.
But what Kimberley says is the big difference. This is a public square, but it adjoins a corporate development, and it has the movement or the porosity of the lane network directly below it. So it works at a number of levels, I hope.
thus its ability to be activated on weekends
Yep.
as well as weekdays. And Ross?
Yeah, you mentioned a good word there in terms of activation. And when we started the competition process, what was kind of fascinating was this creation of this new square and the community building directly next to the tower. How does that work? How's it going to look and feel? And we really kind of studied that a lot because we knew that the development of the ground plane was going to be really critical to winning the project. And we, I suppose, threw out ideas internally in the practice to sort of challenge that and look at the entrance sequences and the way people move through the space. In the end, we settled with the way actually it was effectively defined. And I think the success of that relationship is the way that the community building sits in that space to sort of define the edges and the redevelopment of Jackson on George. And the circulation is around that space. So the circulation actually occurs on either side. You've got the flow of people across Jackson on George going from George Street down into the new Rugby Plaza and on onto Pitt Street, or turning left to the ferries. And then you, as Kimberley was just saying, you have the flow of people in and out of the tower and the business innovation space on the south side of that plaza. Since the competition, we've been working with the City of Sydney very closely to develop the landscaping proposals for that square. And a really interesting component of that is the scale of the space and how it's used. And so there's a configuration of trees within that, because squares can be too big. If they're too big, they cannot function. They can be a dead space. So we think there's been an awful lot of work looking at making those spaces actually function for the city.
Another aspect of the project, it's only one piece of a larger precinct, and I guess a question for Kimberley initially, the work being done with adjoining owners around that precinct to get a coordinated approach?
It's really important that we work particularly with our directly adjacent neighbours, so with Wanda and with Mirvac, to make sure that we're not just kind of plonked in the middle of two developments. It needs to be properly integrated, particularly on the laneway levels. So we have shared retail plans, looked at how people move through those spaces. We've looked at how we can maintain the existing retail that sits within Mirvac and make sure that we're not actually competing against each other for competition. So that will continue. It has been going for some time, but it'll continue for many months, I expect.
Whereas I don't mind a bit of competition. I don't like things too orchestrated in a way, just saying. But you're right. It's an ensemble between Wanda's two towers, Lendlease's multi-development, through to Mirvac, who's coming down the pipeline, and we haven't even got a defined imagery to show of that, but that's a Pitt Street development. We've got Polly from China, who's got an approval for a hotel. They got the stock exchange interested in how this is working to the lane. Telstra's now agreed that, well, preliminary agreement that their site can be redeveloped, and possibly the Ausgrid site is being, the air rights are being folded into the Mirvac project. So this is an extremely detailed jigsaw puzzle of coordinating 15 years of development to achieve a single outcome of, and it has to work with floodwaters and it has to work with vehicle movements and all that. So I just want to stress it's so unique, and it shouldn't be, but it's so unique to have carved out publicly owned space, either in the lane network or the square. It was only in the 71 that the city managed to close the first block of Martin Place to traffic. And all we did was convert a road to a pedestrian space, sequentially up until it hit Macquarie Street. That was, a fundamental change in the way the city would work, could be envisaged. This is like the fourth generation of that thinking, and so anyway, that's an important factor, I think.
It is, and I think that when I first read the APDG controls, which had the opt-in elements to it, I thought it was quite forward-thinking. I didn't think the chances of getting all of that to happen in that area were pretty low when you look at the Telstra building and the Energy Australia building. However, you look, and it's probably 12 years since that was released, the benefit of that to create more space for jobs in the city is almost going to get there at some point. You can actually see it happening.
Yeah.
But for who? And I guess one last question from me, and if anybody's got any questions, we'll refer to the audience. But the user of the space is changing rapidly in our city, and you talked about the T-shirt brigade, and it's sort of an evolution for me. I think I described it previously of the blue-collar worker transitioning to a white-collar worker, and it's now the no-collar worker. And how much of this precinct is really going to be dominated by those more transient users than the traditional white-collar worker that we've been designing for? Maybe Ross, have you?
I think they're looking for a different type of space, but not just the space where the focus might have been traditionally on the tower and the internal environment of that building. I don't think it's anything about that anymore. I mean, we're working with a number of technological companies, and their big focus is looking beyond the tower. It's creating zones that people want to be, places people want to be, because in technology is changing so rapidly. You don't have to, with these companies, you don't have to work at the office. You could do your work remotely, but you don't get that interaction and innovation if people are just all isolated sitting at home. And so, and within the technology industries, they're trying to attract the best. It's a global market, whether it's California, Australia, or anywhere else in the world, and they're trying to compete for those people. And how do you get them somewhere? And so those people are looking for something completely different, the sort of new generations. And it's really about what else is there? What is there? Is there a life to that place? What benefits in terms of the interaction with the city or the people there do they get? Sydney's got massive amount going for it. I lived here for 3 years. I caught the Manly Ferry. It's a fantastic experience. And but the CBD is changing rapidly and being reinvigorated. And we strongly believe that projects like this will just add to that. And I think I tried to hint in my presentation is our job is actually the easy bit, relatively speaking, is that it's the work that's been done to date, the years and years of work and trying to bring these planning regulations into a position where these projects can actually happen. So that's, I think, where we come from.
I just would maybe reflect on when the idea of the innovation space was emerging, and it was, a reflection of what that action was. But we took market soundings, and we wanted to. For example, we asked how many of those managers of that kind of space, whether there's quite a few across the city now, would want to do it at that scale, would prepare to take it on, and they literally came into a workshop with the city, and there was very strong support. They could see with 3 floors how you can almost take a scholarship in a way and progress through an incubator, an accelerator and an SME space, and then you have to graduate, literally, to make room for the next lot. And there'd be people who would make it competitively, who'd want to come in and make the experience, the theme and the ambience of that. So we weren't certain, but we were convinced that there was a place for that. In fact, office rents have got so high now that it's become even more critical to have carved out subsidised space for people testing their capacity to engage with the business. Some won't work naturally, but those that do those with real potential to globally engage, that's what that is designed for. And so the squares, the lanes and so on will have another life which is attached to that, plus everything else. The tourism life, the Sydney-siders' life, coming into the city for the big events, Vivid and New Year's. It's going to be multi-dimensional.
We talked about the, it's an important precinct development. It's not just a building, and it's a whole precinct. It's all about placemaking, and we talked about the interdependency of between the different sections of the precinct, and Kimberley talked about the collaborative process to the other sections of the precinct. I want to get into Graham's input on the different the other strategies to ensure the success of the different section of the development. Let's say, if one if one section doesn't go ahead, or there's what risks are there?
Yes. What if they don't participate, or it just doesn't go ahead? What do you do? I guess is the question.
Yeah. Well, you could think of that question in many different ways. The what if. I mean, the city's taking a calculated risk. It's going to. I think there's two options around the innovation space. One is no rent for 20 years, and the other is for massively subsidised rent for 99 years. But there's outgoings which are substantial, and so there are calculated risks for the city. But there's something other than the tower and the climate, the marketplace for the tower, I would imagine, is very strong, because, as you know, commercial office space in the city of Sydney is now running riot for rents. I just feel it's so strong. It can cope with adjustments or uneventualities, all sorts of things, because you've got the possibility to reprogram that space, the square, to use it in many different ways, very actively and event-driven, or passively and recluse-driven. So I'm very confident that the basic genesis is robust. But there are always risks, and we've had to battle through quite a few details associated with the joining up with the other developments, from flood through to vehicle access. It's not been easy.
I think fortunately though that those developers see that there's a big advantage in us working together. That's been our experience so far, and particularly when we can look at an example like Barangaroo, where you've got such a large area of the city, and these separate buildings all benefiting from this very active, successful ground plane. I think that helps for us to encourage for the parties to work together.
I would just say, from my perspective, one of the challenges is the decorporatisation of the retail, I don't know, would you say the retail tenancies? I think the challenge is, how do you, deliver a laneway experience like Central Park or Ash Street or anything like that with the same degree of edginess, the same degree of individual tenants making their mark, the same degree of diversity. And I think it's, they're fine architects, but I think also that's a challenge for the architects, and it's a challenge for probably Lendlease, and it's a challenge for us to try and get an organic outcome.
I had a question. I wanted Graham perhaps to expand on something. First of all, it's really good to see the city being so instrumental in unlocking developments like this one. But what comes to mind, especially recently in Sydney is the differing interests between public and private development. And we have examples in Sydney where these two interests conflict very often. I guess I want to understand perhaps better how the public good, which we see is conflicting with profitability of private developers. How can these two? How can the public good actually can be preserved when such complex developments are put in place? I don't want to be leading, but at Barangaroo, for example, we saw good intentions being modified because economic interests were different from the public good. So I can see that the planning instruments are very strong from the beginning, and that there is and maybe these planning instruments have been put together in consultation with the private sector. But maybe, Graham, you could help me understand a bit better.
Firstly, the planning instruments aren't worth the paper they're printed on the day the development's finished. So the council could change, the Minister for Planning could change, the State of New South Wales could change the planning system. That doesn't provide any security at all. So I was interested exactly in the point you've made. And so, for example, we've secured the cycle space, the community building and the plaza as a stratum permanently. The lanes have got public easements, public positive covenant easements on them if they're not dedicated. And even the retail, the small business space, it's really about promoting small business and the opportunity to get diversity and different minds at work in food and beverage and retail offerings. That's on a covenant as well. So we've recognised that issue and we've sealed it in property rights, not the vagaries of planning.
And the developer willingly so, because that's the certainty they want to provide as well.
I mean, the question wasn't meant to be critical or anything like that. It's very good to see that. Probably, is it a lesson learned from past experiences?
It is a lesson learned.
There we go.
Yeah, it is a lesson learned.